Alright, before I get started on the actual jig building process itself, I just wanted to show a couple of things here real quick while I've got a rib in the jig. This rib is one of the end ribs. It's got the extra vertical pieces here, as well as a couple of extra supports. Where are those at? Here. That's how you can tell that this is an end rib, but that's not important right now. What I wanted to point out was just a couple of features of the jig itself. You see here these huge cutouts that I put in it. These cutouts initially were intended so that I could come in here with a clamp and in effect do both gussets at the same time around the whole rib. But that proved not to work, basically, to my satisfaction, because for one thing, when you come in here with a clamp, it's very hard to see what this back gusset is doing. And when you clamp these, they tend to slide around and move a little bit, and it's very difficult to see what this back side gusset is doing. You can't tell what the epoxy's doing, if it's running or oozing out and making a mess, and it's just hard to get stuff aligned properly. And the other thing is some parts of the jig, like up here on the nose where these little holes are, and then if you come back here to the back, there's some smaller holes here as well. Reason being is if I made these big enough to get clamps into here, it would remove so much material from the jig that it would either render the jig completely useless because this tail half would just fall off, or it would be so weak that the jig wouldn't be stable, and I was afraid that ultimately the cap strips would not lay straight or flat, and it would be kind of a warped rib. So I couldn't put clamps on these areas with the small holes, which meant that the rib would have to be removed and flipped over, and those gussets would have to be put on after the fact. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have to do a couple of gussets on the opposite side after the fact, I might as well just do all the gussets on the opposite side. And ultimately it turned out that I was not pleased with the clamps. I thought the clamps themselves were way too tight, and they put way too much pressure on the gussets, so I've decided not to clamp at all. I just go ahead and put these on with finger pressure and then let them sit. So these big gaping holes, as far as clamping goes, are pointless, but they do serve well for marking your pieces when you're laying out these cap strip supports. You can come in here with a pencil and mark a line on the pieces to show you exactly where you need to cut. So I will show you some, I think I have some still photos of that, but that's really a good use for these big gaping holes. And the other thing that I did with this particular jig are these little fish eyes. They're little cams, and I'll get more into that a little bit later as well. But they're basically just dowel rod that was sliced down to just under half-inch slices, so they sit below the top of the cap strip. They're drilled off center so that when you rotate them, you can rotate them away from the cap strip and it will release the cap strip. I don't know how well you can see that space there. And then of course when you rotate them back, they swing over and hold the piece tight. They're just held in place with run-of-the-mill drywall screws. Not very fancy, but very effective. I feel kind of funny working on my ribs sometimes because I get the feeling that I'm being watched. These look like a bunch of eyeballs to me, and I feel like I'm being stared at the whole time I'm out here working. So that's just some of the little thought processes that I had when I was building the jig itself, and since I had this rib currently in place, I just thought I would cover some of those minor details right off the bat, but I'll get into the actual building of the jig a little bit later on. Alright, here is my rib jig. This is obviously finished. I'll go through some of the building processes here sometime. But I just wanted to give you a view of a complete jig that I made and some of the ideas behind it. Originally, I wanted to make it the same shape, or roughly the same shape as the rib itself, because what I wanted to do, if you see here, you can see the outline of the rib, and I made the jig slightly wider all the way around than the rib itself, just so that would give me room to mount these cams and these what I call backing plates around the perimeter on the outside of the rib itself. The material of the jig is just white shelf. I've got it at Home Depot. This particular piece, I believe, started out at 12 inches wide. You can probably make one out of 10-inch wide shelf, and the length was 6 feet. I like this because they're very flat and relatively smooth on top, and just a nice piece to work with. I was a little leery about using boards, just because I knew that building these ribs was going to take quite a while, and I thought if I used a board, that over time the board may warp, and then that would render the ribs at that point warped, or at least not the same as the ones previous to the warping. So I went with this shelving material because it's really solid and it won't warp or twist. The cutouts are here originally, as I said before, I wanted to clamp both sides of the gussets at the same time, but that actually proved mute, just because these other holes I couldn't make big enough to get clamps on for obvious reasons. If these holes are any bigger, this front end would be very unstable or just non-existent, because it would be completely cut off. So that meant I had to flip the rib over to get to these gussets so I can glue these back gussets on, and at that point I figured I might as well just glue all of the back gussets on. So the clamping idea went away. These do provide an open area at all of the joints, so now there is absolutely no place for the epoxy to stick when the rib is in place. So these do serve that purpose very well. I've never had an issue with any of my joints being epoxied right to the jig, because obviously there's nothing here for the epoxy to stick to. So that worked out very well. And like I had mentioned earlier, these big holes allow you access to get a pencil in from underneath when you have your cap strips in place and you're marking your support cap strips. You can lay them on top, and you can come in from underneath and mark off your cut line. That's just one method of doing it. So they do serve two very useful purposes, although the original clamping idea is no longer valid. Although some of you may be able to figure out a way to take this a step further and get that double clamping idea to work, and then you won't have to worry about flipping your ribs over to do the backside gussets. The way that I had made this jig was this, which you probably can't tell very well. There's actually tracing paper on the jig. It's taped down with just regular Scotch tape. I took tracing paper, taped a bunch of sheets end to end, and then laid those on the riblet plan, full-size plan. I took the plan and taped it down to this nice flat counter. I laid it out, tried to smooth out the wrinkles best I could, taped it down. Then I took the tracing paper, laid the tracing paper down over top of the plan, and taped the tracing paper flat. And then I went ahead and I traced the plan onto the tracing paper, all the lines and all the details and whatnot. And then I took that tracing paper and laid it on the shelf. I traced a line roughly, 3/4 of an inch out from the perimeter of the print line. I drew a line all the way around, and that was the cut line for the jig. You can see here's the outside of the print where the cap strip goes, and I went larger than that and drew a line, and that was the cut line for the jig, and as I said before, I did that so I'd have a place to mount my cams and my what I call backing blocks. And that was pretty much it. In a nutshell, that was the way that I did it. And then I came back and I had labeled all of the individual, let me find a better shot here, all of the individual cap strip pieces. I started at the nose and I just labeled them, you know, strip A, B, C, D, E, here's F and G, and I just went on down and marked them all, because what I ended up doing was, and I can't show you that now, I have to go back over to my rib. Stand by 1 second, let me get something here. Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.